fighting is reported tonight on the outskirts of Grozny, capital of the breakaway state of Chechnya. Russian troops, supported by tanks and air power, began their invasion of the rebel territory at first light, in the biggest show of force since the Afghanistan war.
Gunfire is still echoing around the center of Grozny, and there is no talk of peace or compromise in these streets.
It is hard to avoid the conclusion that the Russians are now using terror tactics against the people of Grozny.
These people were civilians trying to flee the fighting.
The car that exploded was parked in the very center of Grozny, alongside the headquarters of the Russian-backed administration.
We witnessed the heart-rending spectacle of the hostages waving white flags from the windows and screaming to the soldiers to stop firing.
The Russians gave up trying to free the hostages in Pervomorskaya today. Instead, they've been pouring rocket and shell fire in an all-out barrage, apparently calculated to obliterate the rebels.
This is Russia's wild frontier, the breakaway mountain republic of Chechnya, where political scores are settled with tanks. Now a long-running power struggle has erupted into open warfare. Opposition guerrilla fighters were blasted from this forward base in the small town of Argun, just 10 miles from the capital, which they'd pledged to attack. But the regime struck first, killing opposition guerrillas before they withdrew. The losses will not go unanswered. Not by the bandit leader Ruslan Labazanov, the opposition's top gunman, a convicted murderer, unarmed combat instructor, and former presidential bodyguard, a Rambo figure who's sworn to kill the Chechen president for beheading his cousin. Dzhokhar Dudayev is the wild man of Chechen politics, a sort of Caucasus Colonel Gaddafi, an Air Force general who's run Chechnya as a lawless, freebooting bazaar of smuggling and crime since breaking from Moscow 3 years ago. Into this turmoil comes another headache for Boris Yeltsin, his bitter political enemy Ruslan Khasbulatov, once Speaker of the Russian Parliament who challenged his rule in the siege of the Moscow White House. He's now back home, backed by Labazanov's killers, fighting for a new power base. Blood feuds and clan warfare are a way of life here. A fearsome reputation for settling arguments with guns is a tradition that's made Chechnya a byword for violence and organized crime in modern Russia and beyond. Ian Glover-James, ITN, Moscow.
For the second time in 2 days, planes burned on an airfield near the Chechen capital following a raid by unidentified aircraft. As before, the Chechens have claimed that the bombers were Russian, but this cannot be confirmed. Meanwhile, preparations for a possible Russian military invasion of Chechnya appear to be underway. All this afternoon, massive Antonov transport aircraft were arriving at the airport at Vladikavkaz, the nearest Russian town to Chechnya. They brought in a stream of troops and equipment, and many more combat troops are deployed close to the Chechen border. In the Chechen capital Grozny, the threat of Russian intervention appears to have boosted support for the breakaway government that Moscow is trying to remove. Many are joining armed militias and say that they are ready to fight the Russians. These people have grown used to independence since the fall of the Soviet Union. Though they are still officially part of Russia, they seem unwilling to accept it. The militiamen proudly showed us 2 of their Russian prisoners, young men who were captured fighting for the Chechen opposition forces during their failed uprising last weekend. As the crisis deepens, there is no sign that the Chechen president Dzhokhar Dudayev and his supporters will agree to Russia's terms, which effectively amount to surrender. Boris Yeltsin has set a deadline of tomorrow morning for these Chechen militias to lay down their arms. But tonight they've still got their guns, and they seem to be preparing for war. Julian Mannion, News at 10,
inside Chechnya. In spite of Boris Yeltsin's ultimatum, the Chechens have not disarmed and instead are trying to shoot down the Russian jets that appear over Grozny. Though Moscow denies it, there is little doubt that these are Russian Air Force bombers. And today they carried out yet another attack on Grozny airport. Near planes damaged in earlier raids, they hit storage tanks containing 3,000 tons of aviation fuel. The Chechens have no means to put the fires out and no means to protect their own aircraft. It's hard to avoid the conclusion that these repeated bombing attacks on Grozny airport are a deliberate act of intimidation by the Russian Air Force, and perhaps also a preparation for a full-scale airborne assault in this area. And only hours later, the Russians struck again. At an airfield 30 miles from Grozny, they destroyed what little air power the Chechens themselves possessed. The outdated Chechen planes were hit with terrible precision, though a stray bomb killed a man in a nearby village. But the Chechens who support the separatist government of General Dudayev remain defiant. Their fledgling state has gained the reputation of being a haven for mafia criminals. But today many of these people told me that they are ready to die fighting if the Russians invade. Tonight, Russian armor is moving near the Chechen border. Boris Yeltsin says that he will restore constitutional rule in Chechnya. But it now seems that only the outright use of force can possibly achieve that. Julian Mannion, News at 10, Grozny. Today, the men of Muslim Chechnya prayed in the center of their capital. They now know that the Russians will not invade for at least another 2 weeks, and they see that as a victory. In a nearby basement is one of the reasons that Boris Yeltsin pulled back from the brink. For this is where the Chechens are holding some of their Russian prisoners, in a dark, windowless room that could all too easily become a place of execution. These are Russian soldiers who were captured last Saturday during an uprising that was officially mounted by the Chechen opposition. In fact, it is now clear that it was largely staged by the Russian Secret Service, which recruited these young men from various elite units of the Russian army. They were told that the Chechens would welcome them, but their tanks were blown to pieces in the streets of Grozny. Today, a few of the 70-odd prisoners were allowed out to repair some of the tanks for their captors. But they know that their real role is as hostages, who may simply be executed if the Russian army invades.
We hope that television will show the Russian people what has happened to us, and that other Russian soldiers won't do what we did, because they'll die here.
The Chechens are playing their trump card for all it's worth. Some Russian MPs have been allowed to meet the prisoners, but there's no progress in getting their release. Russia is now faced with her very own hostage crisis. Julian Mannion, News at 10, Grozny.
Chanting their defiance at Moscow. While negotiations continued in the nearby presidential palace, crowds in the central square of the Chechen capital, Grozny, had their own answer to Russia's demands. They lay down their weapons. Everybody seems convinced the Russians will invade, and rumour of imminent attack was passed around the crowd by marauding gunmen. There's little shortage of arms in this city. The tension was broken when the Chechen military leader emerged to say that Moscow had extended its deadline to the 15th of December, though he wasn't impressed.
It depends on Russia. If they want war, they'll get war.
In a yard behind the presidential palace, modern T-72 tanks, captured by the government, are being repaired. These were the only tanks that survived an opposition attack on the capital last weekend, which now looks like a Russian-sponsored operation. Russian soldiers captured during that attack were being forced to do the repairs. And one Russian tank commander said he'd been recruited by the Russian counterintelligence service.
They offered me and other officers a contract, which they said was for a combat mission. First they said it was just to maintain the tanks for the opposition. Then they said we must drive them into town.
More Russian soldiers are being kept captive in the basement of a nearby building, the Chechens having lifted an immediate threat to kill them. They're too valuable for that. The soldiers confirmed to us they'd been sent from 3 bases around Moscow. One showed us his Russian army dog tags. They'd been promised early release from the army if they took part in the attack.
We've been set up. We didn't come here as mercenaries. We were sent here as Russian soldiers and officers. Now we've been abandoned by our government.
They told us there was no risk at all, and when we got home we would be demobilized from the army.
Moscow has been wanting to be rid of the Chechen regime since they declared independence in 1991. But it's only the last 4 months that Russia has stepped up its active support for the opposition, believing it has strategic interests at stake in the volatile Caucasus region. If Moscow's aim has been to intimidate Grozny, it's clearly failed. After a week of threats, the people here seem more determined than ever, both to hold on to their prisoners and, if necessary, to fight the Russians. Tonight, Moscow's policy in the Caucasus seems in a bigger mess than ever. Ian Williams, Channel 4 News, Chechnya.
Good evening, this is ITN. Tonight's headlines. Yeltsin sends the tanks into war against Russia's breakaway republic. Heavy fighting is reported tonight on the outskirts of Grozny, capital of the breakaway state of Chechnya. Russian troops, supported by tanks and air power, began their invasion of the rebel territory at first light, in the biggest show of force since the Afghanistan war. The Chechen president has warned the entire region could turn into a bloodbath. Within the last few minutes, Chechen authorities claim to have taken 40 Russian prisoners.
Russian helicopter gunships and ground troops in action this evening in Chechnya. Despite the appeals for this not to turn into a war, the Russians are meeting resistance and being forced to fight. The columns of troops and armoured vehicles crossed the Chechen border at first light this morning. They rolled past a largely unresisting population. But within the Chechen capital, Grozny, hundreds of armed men say they are ready to fight, suicidal or not. It's still not clear whether the Russians intend to storm the city and risk massive civilian casualties, nor whether the Chechen leader, Zhokar Dudayev, is serious about resolving this peacefully. The invasion is, however, not going down well in Moscow. This evening, close to 1,000 people turned out in freezing temperatures to hear a former ally of Boris Yeltsin, Yegor Gaidar, remind the president he's sending troops against fellow Russians. Heavy casualties on either side would be deeply unpopular here. President Yeltsin is still in hospital tonight, recovering from a minor nose operation. But that won't protect him if this invasion goes wrong. He ordered it against the opposition of the Russian parliament, and the responsibility is entirely his. James Mates, ITN, Moscow.
The Russian President Boris Yeltsin today called for the crisis in the breakaway region of Chechnya to be resolved urgently. Officials from the rebel government are holding last-ditch talks with Moscow this afternoon to try to prevent all-out war. Yesterday, Russian tanks were ordered to surround the Chechen capital of Grozny. Our Moscow correspondent Julian Mannion has sent this report from Grozny.
On a rooftop in Grozny, Chechen militiamen get ready to confront the Russian army, which they know is only miles away. As last-ditch negotiations take place this afternoon, most here still believe that they will soon be facing a full-scale Russian attack. Throughout the capital, small pockets of defenders are preparing to fight house by house. These Chechen troops on the top floor of our hotel are members of General Dudayev's so-called kamikaze regiment. 3 miles outside Grozny, the Chechens have placed a thin line of volunteers. They're manning shallow trenches and an old World War II bunker. But there is little chance that they could halt the Russian tank regiments that are now deploying somewhere out there in the snow. The Russian armoured columns are still massing at several points in and around Chechnya. One thrust, supported by helicopter gunships, has been through the tiny republic of Ingushetia, which borders Chechnya. The people here are strongly opposed to the Russian intervention and have tried to halt the tanks with makeshift barricades. Today, the Russian Defense Minister Pavel Grachev accused the Ingushetians, who number just 200,000, of declaring war on Russia. And there have been other sources of irritation for the Russians in spite of their overwhelming force. Last night, a Russian unit of 47 officers and men surrendered without firing a shot after being surrounded by the Chechen militia. The soldiers explained that they did not want to open fire on the Chechens.
The Russian push into Chechnya has inflamed passions among people who are not normally supporters of General Dudayev. Chechen women are now joining militia units. On the other hand, there is now enormous pressure on the separatists to offer concessions in this afternoon's talks. The problem is to see what middle ground between the two sides can now exist. The training and equipment of the Chechen militia is pathetically inadequate for the task of defending their capital. But there may yet be just enough of them prepared to fight to make the Russians pay a price. And that is now the only bargaining card that these separatists have left. Julian Mannion, ITN, in Grozny.
Well, live now to Professor Peter Frank, who's our regular commentator on the former Soviet Union. Peter, does Boris Yeltsin know what he's letting himself in for?
I think he probably knows what he's letting himself in for, but he probably also can't see a way out of it. There are enormous benefits to be gained to Yeltsin if he can win this particular confrontation. But the chances of him doing that seem to me to be declining. There's little doubt but that with the armour that he's got, the number of men under arms that he has, ringing Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, that he can take that city if that's what he decides to do, if the talks this afternoon break down. But once that happens, then the Chechens will take to the mountains, as they did in the last century, as they've done in this century. They can conduct a guerrilla war along the lines of what happened in Afghanistan. Certainly a lot of the Russian troops, as Julian Mannion's report pointed out, won't want to fire against, if not their co-nationals, then at least against their co-citizens. And it seems to me that Yeltsin is very, very finely balanced indeed on this, with the balance of probability actually against him.
Well, Peter, you mentioned some peace talks taking place this afternoon. Are you saying they're likely to fail?
I'm not sure that they're likely to fail. There are obviously reasons why both Dudayev, President Dudayev of Chechnya, might want them to succeed, because the chances of his being deposed increase if there is actual military intervention. Yeltsin will quite clearly want them to succeed because the amount of opposition building up against him domestically, that is to say back in Moscow across the political elite, is very, very great indeed. But at the same time, neither of these two men and the people representing them want to concede very much. And if they really get very much dug in on their positions, if it becomes insoluble, or seems to be to them, then I think some sort of military clash then becomes inevitable.
Peter Frank, thanks very much.
In the hills around Grozny, the Chechens are using their few big guns to try and hold up the remorseless Russian advance. This morning, the fighting reached the outskirts of the capital itself. The target, a pair of Russian army helicopters. Nearby, the rattle of small arms fire and occasional heavier explosions. Just over there behind us, there's been the sound of heavy machine gun fire, and the Chechen soldiers tell us that Russian armored vehicles are creeping forward, trying to get into the outskirts of Grozny. In our hotel, men from General Dudayev's so-called kamikaze regiment formed up in the corridors and then moved out, ready for action. Outside in the street, they prayed and then distributed ammunition. If the Russians now take the final step of storming the capital, these men will face the most overwhelming odds. Julian Mannion, News at 10, Grozny.
United in their outrage. This was the first opportunity the Duma has had to give its verdict since Russian troops moved into Chechnya at the weekend. Speaker after speaker attacked the military operation. Only the Women of Russia party and Vladimir Zhirinovsky's extreme nationalists backed the president. Most worrying for Mr. Yeltsin were ominous warnings from his one-time close allies that his political future is now at stake.
The president can understand and should understand that the political stability of Russia, the stability of Russian democracy, his own position strongly depends on the realistic and peaceful solutions of the problem in Chechnya.
Another prominent reformer and chairman of the powerful Duma Defense Committee suggested the reformers move into active opposition to Mr. Yeltsin unless Russia pulls its troops out.
We have to stop the military invasion. We have to withdraw troops from the Chechen Republic and start direct negotiations with Dudayev.
Mr. Yeltsin's one-time finance minister provided a lonely voice in support of his old boss.
Let's not talk about history, let's talk about Afghanistan. It's the question of law and order today. People were getting killed there for 3 years.
Overall, it seemed like a return to the old days of gloves-off confrontation between Parliament and the President. Only this time there seems little that Parliament, stripped of much of its power, can do except express moral outrage. To the frustration of deputies here, President Yeltsin does appear to be acting within the Constitution. And anyway, the body that's supposed to adjudicate between him and the Duma, the Constitutional Court, isn't functioning right now because President Yeltsin hasn't got round to nominating all the judges.
On the road to Grozny, a group of Chechen women prepare for another attempt to slow the Russian army by passive resistance. There are tears of emotion mixed with fear. With their men in front, they march in a cordon towards the Russian lines about a mile away. In the distance, tanks, their guns for the moment silent. The Chechen leader, Chechnya, halted his people before they confronted the Russians. For the last 2 days, he has been holding secret talks with the Russian commanding general. This morning, Chechnya agreed to take us into the Russian lines. We followed his station wagon towards the tanks. They have not moved forward since entering Chechnya, and today we learned that their senior officers have been resisting Moscow's order to attack the Chechens. Chechnya wanted to pay another visit to the commander of the 19th Motorized Division, General Ivan Babichev. Late last night, the general told a Russian journalist that he expected to be relieved of his command because of his refusal to advance. This morning, Chechnya was told that the general has been called back to headquarters. A Russian major said that his men do not want war, then told us to stop filming him. Chechnya is carrying out an extraordinary one-man mission to build bridges with the Russian troops and undermine their desire to fight. It is now clear that at least one Russian army division is dragging its feet in what was supposed to be a decisive use of force against the Chechens. Back at the Chechen cordon, Chechnya told his people about his contacts with the Russian troops. These people are confronted by a Russian army that could crush their resistance at any moment, but seems to be developing increasing doubts over whether it wants to do it. The Chechens are hoping that the contacts between the two sides will persuade the Russians not to complete the invasion of their land. Julian Mannion, News at 10, on the road to Grozny. After days of bombing and artillery fire, the front line near Grozny is eerily quiet. On the northern outskirts of the city, Chechen volunteers keep a watchful eye on the Russian tanks stationed on the skyline above them. In the last few days, the tanks have done great damage to this civilian area. Today their guns were silent, but the portents for peace are still not good. Negotiations between the two sides have not so far restarted, and foreign journalists working in Grozny have now received clear warning that the Russians wish their presence here to end. Reports on the Chechen crisis have been beamed around the world from a satellite dish brought in by the EBU, a consortium of European television companies. The EBU has now been warned by Moscow that if it does not halt transmissions, its signal may be jammed, an action that would be in clear violation of international telecommunications agreements. And journalists have now been told by the Russian Ministry of Defense that their safety in Grozny cannot be guaranteed. One Russian official has apparently said that journalists who remain in the city may be specifically targeted. If this satellite dish is jammed or forced out of Grozny, it will be a return to the Russian information tactics of the Soviet era. It will also diminish what little international restraint there may be on Russian military action in Chechnya. Julian Mannion, ITN, in Grozny. As the Russian deadline of midnight tonight approaches, the Chechens are still erecting flimsy barricades at the entrances to Grozny. Their militia troops are standing by for combat with an enemy that outnumbers them, outguns them, and has complete command of the air. But the Chechens remain defiant, and tonight their leader, General Dudayev, refused to attend last-ditch talks proposed by Moscow on the grounds, he said, that the Russians are not sincere. At the front line, where the Russian tanks are visible, there is little sign that they are preparing for an all-out assault. In fact, their troops appear to be digging in. It now appears that Moscow's strategy will be to expand the previous air campaign against Chechnya by bombing what are described as strategic targets in the capital. The threat to use air power suggests that the Russians are still reluctant to commit their ground troops to street fighting against the Chechens. Meanwhile, the majority of foreign journalists working in Grozny have left the city. The European Broadcasting Union, whose satellite dish has been transmitting pictures of the crisis to the outside world, has come under fierce Russian pressure to leave. There's even been a Russian attempt to jam the satellite transmissions. In the end, the threat of Russian airstrikes tomorrow finally persuaded the EBU to close the satellite television operation in the Chechen capital. What you are watching is the last news report to be transmitted out of Grozny. As soon as it's been sent, this satellite dish will be taken down, and what that means is that the world will no longer be able to witness the fate of the Chechen people or the actions of the Russian army. Julian Mannion, ITN, Grozny. Many had believed that Grozny's presidential palace would by now be a smoking ruin. But instead this morning, the Chechen Vice President Zemlihan Yanderbiev was leafing through telegrams of support, including several from separatist movements in other regions of Russia. In spite of last night's deadline, Russian planes did not bomb the capital. And down in the square, Chechen nationalists were able to hold their normal prayer meeting, though the number of those willing to stand out in the open had plainly dwindled. At noon, the deployment of an armoured vehicle signalled the imminent arrival of President Jochar Dudayev from his safe house away from the city centre. The general arrived unobtrusively in a station wagon, the best way, his security men believe, to protect him from Russian attack. Moments later, Dudayev gave ITN an exclusive interview in which he said that he would never bargain away Chechnya's claim to independence and that he personally is not afraid to die.
I feel fear only before Almighty God. I fear nothing on earth. I am preparing to meet the Almighty with a clear conscience and an unstained uniform.
Fighting has now erupted in a village just north of Grozny. A Chechen anti-aircraft gun stood by helplessly as Russian tanks blasted Chechen positions a little way ahead. Even in the area still in Chechen hands, there was tremendous tension as the troops prepared to face a possible armoured attack. The Russians seem to be making a determined push to take this village on the outskirts of Grozny. What we don't know yet is whether this marks the beginning of their major offensive against the capital. Further back, volunteers wearing the green headbands of a martyr to Islam headed for the front. They still face the threat of an aerial blitz or even all-out combat with the Russian army. But no one we met is ready to give up. Julian Mannion, ITN, Grozny. A foggy dawn revealed the damage. In a second attack on the Grozny television tower, which normally transmits Chechen TV, the Russian warplanes hit it with astonishing precision. A bomb landed at the foot of the tower, completely demolishing the control room. 3 people were injured, including 1 woman. The successful attacks against this transmission facility are designed to cut General Dudayev off from the civilian population. Chechen television, which was broadcasting programs urging people to resist the Russians virtually around the clock, is now off the air. Nearby, the Russians also bombed a gas storage center. The bomb wrecked a worker's cabin, but missed the storage tanks. Men struggled to repair damaged pipes amid a powerful smell of gas. In the city, another bomb landed next to an old lady's house, leaving her shocked and angry. Last night, after the first bombs fell, the owner of a local bar played mournfully on his piano. The bar is in a former World War II bomb shelter, and several journalists spent the night there. Apart from the danger, the civilian population here is facing increasing difficulties. The once bustling central market is largely empty. Rows of stalls are abandoned and bare. Many people have left the city, and one of the main hotels is now completely empty. Raisa Kuznetsova is one of the maids. She is 70 years old, and as the Russian grip on the city tightens, she is becoming increasingly desperate.
The children are cold. I'm cold. It's not warm in here. There's no bread in the shops.
In the trenches northeast of Grozny, the Chechen soldiers know that Russian tanks are moving down from the hills nearby. Russian snipers have begun to fire at them. Amid the tension, a horse and rider suddenly appeared. It was a Chechen soldier who rode up to the trench line to greet his friends. The Chechens are not only determined to fight, but to do it in their own way. Julian Mannion, News at 10, Grozny. In seconds, the Russian jets screamed in and left half a dozen houses smashed, a broken gas pipe burning. An elderly woman tried to describe what happened. Others were in shock. In the city hospital, emergency treatment for 7 wounded. At least 1 person died. In daylight, devastation. A street corner of bungalow-style homes leveled by the blasts. The victims, ordinary people, trying to live ordinary lives in a city under Russian siege. A city where food is scarce, water cut off, and now bombs fall from the night sky. It is hard to avoid the conclusion that the Russians are now using terror tactics against the people of Grozny. It may be that their aim is to drive as many people as possible out so that they can, if necessary, deal with the Chechen fighters in a largely empty city. Another stick of bombs fell in a main road in the center of Grozny, blowing out the windows of an oil industry training school. As we filmed the damage, the sounds of heavy gunfire could be heard from the northern outskirts of the city, where the heaviest fighting so far is taking place. On the main highway to the south, cars flashing their lights warned us that the road was coming under sporadic fire. We made it through at high speed and came to the start of an extraordinary demonstration by supporters of Chechen independence. Thousands of Chechens turned out to line the road for about 20 miles. It was a massive rejection of Russian rule. The chant, freedom or death. The Russian government now knows that the only way to crush this surging desire for Chechen independence will be with tanks. Julian Mannion, News at 10, on the road to Grozny.
There was an uneasy calm as we drove into the center of Grozny. The people were trying to do what they could after a night of the heaviest bombing since Russia invaded Chechnya. Then the planes returned. At first, the roar of the fighter bombers caused no alarm, ordinary people believing it's safe to go out in daylight. Bombing at night, reconnaissance by day had been the tactic of the Russian Air Force, until today, as we were filming, the calm was shattered.
It's 11 days since the Russians invaded, and this is the closest they've come to the presidential palace, just about 700 yards down the road. This attack came without any warning whatsoever, and as you can see, civilians are all around.
It was just then we were told to flee for our lives. Only seconds after the deafening blast, the warplanes returned. This is what they left behind. The appalling aftermath of what Russia has called precision bombing. These people weren't separatist fighters, mafia gunmen, or even soldiers. Help me, this woman cries. Help did come. Every passing car or bus was hailed down to use as makeshift ambulances. Bombs and missiles continued to rain down on this city. We counted dozens of dead, most of them civilians. And in Moscow, they say the Air Force is hitting strategic targets. Amongst the dead, an American woman freelance photographer. Her close friend and colleague could do nothing. This is the carnage of daytime bombing, which despite the advanced technology of a former superpower, proved inaccurate. Military strategists say it's a tactic of an invading force intent on demoralizing the Chechen people. But as Grozny tried to absorb this, the biggest bombardment since President Yeltsin ordered his troops in, General Dadayev was still claiming that his people had 2 choices, either death or freedom. This woman says she can't leave, she has nowhere to go.
Please don't leave us in this situation, because it's very terrible.
But the might of Russia's Air Force, with its awesome firepower, fell down on Grozny's people today. Yet so many are prepared to carry on suffering. The warplanes may be above them, these people have little, but they refuse to surrender. Tonight, this city is under bombardment again. Whatever is said in the Kremlin, the people of the Chechen capital think nothing will stop Russia from continuing its onslaught. Andrew Simmons, News at 10, Grozny. Fresh columns of Russian tanks, armoured personnel carriers, and lorries piled high with ammunition have been rumbling across the snowy plains of northern Chechnya, heading for Grozny. But it's a sign not so much of military might, but of the weakness of this entire operation. Many are reinforcements, replacing soldiers or units who officials say are too inexperienced or lack the will to fight, especially when confronted with unarmed civilians. And this route is through territory held by pro-Moscow groups who oppose President Dudayev. It's the only route the army can now be sure of passing through unobstructed. The authorities in Dagestan, to the east of Chechnya, have asked for and received an assurance their territory will not be used by troops in transit to Grozny. The first stop for this convoy is the town of Znamenskoye, where a division of Special Forces and Interior Ministry troops waits for orders to move towards Grozny, orders for which they have no enthusiasm.
I believe this operation has not been thoroughly planned, and we are not being given the supplies we need for the task. The mood here is bad. The troops think that nobody needs this conflict, that it will be long-lasting and can only make the situation worse across the region.
Most of these troops are conscripts from the Kuban region of southern Russia. They've set up roadblocks across northern Chechnya, and during our visit they brought to the base an injured local man who they'd shot in the legs after he failed to stop when ordered to. The man was unarmed and drunk. This unit had been ordered to disarm local pro-Moscow opposition fighters, but they've abandoned that, fearing it may inflame the situation. It will be the job of this unit to pacify the civilian population once the regular army has done its job. But pacifying Chechnya will not be an easy job, and it's not a task that's looked forward to with any great relish by these men. Colonel Polozov has no respect for Defense Minister Pavel Grachov, a mood shared, he says, by colleagues. He believes this conflict cannot end cleanly.
I believe that by seizing Grozny, the problem of Chechnya will not be solved. It will simmer for a long time. It will be a never-healing wound for Russia.
A short distance from the base, a bullet-scarred portrait of Lenin overlooks the central square in Znamenskoye. Alongside it, the headquarters of the Provisional Council, the Moscow-backed opposition group in Chechnya. Inside, fighters mill around with their guns. Moscow had originally ordered the disarming of all armed groups in Chechnya, but here they confirm that although the Russians have taken away their heavy armor, they've left the Kalashnikovs. During our visit, they were handing out permits for the guns to give them a semblance of legality. The Prime Minister of the Council, who could soon be installed by Russia in Grozny, shows little gratitude towards his sponsors in Moscow.
If Russia continues to act as badly and clumsily as she has until now, she will only increase the number of her enemies here.
The official line from the army here is that they're still trying to seal, not seize, Grozny, that they're only bombing strategic targets and trying to drive fighters from the city. That makes it sound like there's a strategy, but so far there's little evidence of one among the troops and officers required to carry it out. Ian Williams, Channel 4 News, Northern Chechnya.
Chechen fighters lightly armed and pinned down by heavy Russian artillery. This is just over 4 miles outside Grozny. Russia's armor is in the distance. It's the fourth successive day of intense fighting. Grozny now looks like a ghost town. After a lull in bombing today, the fighter bombers return this evening. Grozny is now a city in which living has become nearly impossible, with all services cut. Families daring to stay on have to get water from a frozen pond. Most people who are able to leave have done so. The majority of those left in Grozny are ethnic Russians. They say they've no option but to stay on here, living in the misery of makeshift bomb shelters and cellars, because their relatives are 1,000 miles away. Thousands more have been fleeing Chechnya today. This is where their journeys become safe, on the eastern border. There were long queues of refugees fleeing into neighbouring Dagestan. Border troops appeared sympathetic to their plight and didn't hinder them. In Grozny, they prayed for peace in the Russian Orthodox Church, which doesn't celebrate Christmas for another 2 weeks. Peace and goodwill, however, is a world away for these people. Andrew Simmons, ITN, on the Chechen border. President Yeltsin's message watched by Chechen refugees who have crossed the border to safety. They stared in disbelief when he said airstrikes had ended, and they rejected his claim that Russia has no fight with ordinary Chechen people. Why does he always lie, this woman said. We voted for Yeltsin, now he makes us leave our homes. We don't need Yeltsin, we want Dudayev. Earlier, these people had been angered and distressed as another lorry crossed the border.
What you're hearing on the loudspeakers is a call for all of the people here to gather around this lorry and look inside. It's the latest victim of Grozny's bombings, an unidentified body.
No one knew who he was. Amongst the crowds was Chechnya's Vice President Zelimkhan Yandabayev. Apart from words of defiance to the Russians, he told us there is hope, because hope is the last thing to die. Apartment blocks blazed. Gas pipelines spewed out flames. Chechen trucks had been hit. But the biggest onslaught of this conflict was centered on General Dudayev's headquarters. We've just arrived here about 1,000 yards away from the presidential palace. This is undoubtedly the heaviest fighting in this city since the invasion started 3 weeks ago. It appeared from where we were standing that the presidential palace had been hit, but we couldn't get any closer to confirm this. A rocket landed just behind us. As the rest of the world celebrated the new year, the battle for Grozny, under eerie shadows cast by Russian army flares, turned into a firefight. Here, a Russian tank is hit by the Chechens. This is the very heart of the Chechen capital, and its defenders claimed they repelled a Russian attack. This is how the battle started yesterday. With the first day of 1995 came the roar of Russian tanks captured by the Chechens, driven defiantly towards the presidential palace. At first there was something of a lull in the bombardment by artillery and tanks. It didn't last beyond midday. Overnight the Chechens put up fierce resistance against the Russians here in the city centre, but the shelling is intensifying again, and now they're pulling back. Chechen fighters started regrouping further away from the site of last night's battle. Their fighters, many of them civilians who had taken to arms with shotguns, some with improvised ammunition, were claiming success. They had pushed back the final part of the Russian advance, but the colossal bombardment from Russia's forces was by no means over. As we drove into the very center of Grozny, the scene of a battle which Russia says it won, this is what we saw. There was no doubt about who occupied the presidential palace. It's approaching midday in Grozny, and this is the very center of the city. The presidential palace is behind me. The Russians claim they control it. It's obviously not the case. There was sporadic shelling and sniper fire all around the city. The central square was strewn with the bodies of soldiers and wreckage of Russian armored cars and tanks. As we've seen today, the Chechens aren't being driven out of the city. With their armed vigil inside the palace, they're a small force compared with Russia's might, but even if Grozny does fall, they've vowed to fight on. It was the Chechens, not as Moscow claims the Russians, who were patrolling the streets of Grozny today. Little has changed in this war apart from the intensity of fighting, and civilians are still being caught in it, Here, at least one man killed in a rocket attack on the outskirts, and the warplanes came back. The plight of civilians is symbolized by this extraordinary sight as we left Central Square. A woman alone, all that she now possesses in a bundle, nowhere to go, and an unexploded shell beside her. Andrew Simmons, ITN in Grozny. In Grozny, the presidential palace was hit this morning by shell fire. While the Kremlin is denying that it suffered a tactical defeat at the hands of Chechen fighters, Russian forces are reining back from claims that they control Grozny. As civilians fled under sniper fire, the Chechens were consolidating their positions in the city. Despite renewed shelling and air raids, it does appear a clear fact that the defenders of Grozny have control at the moment. Latest estimates from a group of Russian lawmakers who left Grozny for Moscow yesterday put casualties into the hundreds over the past few days. The Chechen fighters are still adamant they can hold out. This war, despite its escalation, appears to have no effect on their fighting spirit. By complete contrast, the Russian army is now even lower on morale. Taking Grozny won't be an answer either militarily or politically. It would leave them with a long winter war, another chapter to this conflict. And with that prospect, despite reinforcements sent in by their military masters in Moscow, officers on the ground are having increasing problems with dissent. They're faced with two grim prospects: street fighting in Grozny, and if that battle is won, the inevitable guerrilla war which will be waged from the mountains behind them. Andrew Simmons, ITN, on the Chechen border.
In the early hours of this morning, death came to the village of Meskar-Yurt, south of Grozny. Russian aircraft dropped a string of bombs into the center of the village, smashing houses and destroying lives. At least 10 people died in the nighttime carnage, which once again had no evident strategic purpose, except the spreading of terror. The people here do not understand why the heart of their quiet village has suddenly been ripped out by massive Russian bombs, nor do they understand why Western governments, including the British government, which have in the past said so much about human rights in Russia, are now keeping silent. These are the survivors of yesterday's bomb attack on a crossroads near the village of Shali, an attack which killed at least 28 people. ITN has established that the Russians used cluster bombs, bombs that contain scores of separate explosive charges, each encased in a sheath of ball bearings. The bombs set off a blizzard of flying metal. They are weapons designed to kill or maim combat troops. Now Boris Yeltsin's government is using them against civilians that it says are citizens of the Russian Federation. Boris Yeltsin has now apparently ordered a halt to the bombing of Grozny to prevent further civilian casualties. But since his similar promise last week resulted only in a blitz on the capital, few people here have much confidence in his words today. Julian Mannion, News at 10 on the outskirts of Grozny. Until the reported air attack on the presidential palace, the action had been on the ground. Chechen troops tried to flush out Russian snipers near the center of Grozny. A Russian tank shell slammed into Palace Square. Inside the palace, more Russian prisoners, the frightened survivors of Saturday's failed offensive. But the signs are that their army is preparing for another push. Gunfire is still echoing around the center of Grozny, and there is no talk of peace or compromise in these streets. Indeed, the Russian minister in charge of Chechen affairs, Nikolai Yegorov, whose statements range from the hawkish to the dangerously extreme, has promised that as soon as the weather clears, Russian troops will make another attempt to seize the Chechen capital. Near the fighting, one family that had had enough. Two sisters led a 5-year-old child away from the gunfire as teams of Chechen fighters moved towards it. The sisters, Anya and Ludmila, left their home in northern Grozny this morning and without a car or any of their belongings, simply set out to walk through the ravaged city to what they hope will be safety in the south. This morning, the people of Grozny learned once again what Boris Yeltsin means by a bombing halt. Artillery shells instead of aerial bombs rained down on the center of the city. The shells and missiles smashed into apartment blocks, starting fires which the helpless occupants were powerless to put out. Most of the devastation was in residential areas, making a further mockery of the Russian president's claim that he is trying to avoid civilian casualties. Though today there did appear to be some sort of military objective behind the carnage. Russian shells are coming in from their positions just over there and striking near the main road into the city center, just a few hundred yards behind us. And it seems that the Russian objective is to try and sever that part of the city which contains the presidential palace from the rest of the Chechen forces in the south. Under the shell fire, the Chechen fighters remained astonishingly calm. Even while the bombardment continued, fresh troops arrived in the city center, prepared to face a Russian ground attack if it came. Reserves waiting in a nearby cellar chanted songs as they prepared for action. Today they once again struck a telling blow against the Russian army. South of Grozny, in broad daylight, they blew up a bridge which Russian armor was trying to cross. The Russian tanks and their crews plunged into the riverbed below. Part of Grozny, the presidential palace, is ablaze. Set alight by Russian artillery, it is suffering the same fate as the Moscow White House just over a year ago. But here, the Chechens are not ready to give up. News came through of another setback for the Russians. The commander of their Interior Ministry troops, General Viktor Vorbyov, has been killed by a Chechen mortar shell. This came as the Chechens tried to fight off another Russian ground assault near the city center. The Russians are now bombarding the city from 3 separate directions, and the sounds of machine gun fire between the explosions are apparently coming from some of their elite troops that they've now pushed into forward positions. The Chechens seem more somber than in recent days, but they remain grimly determined. On the Russian Christmas Day, Boris Yeltsin's government continued its work of demolishing a city that it claims as its own. Once again, the artillery fire struck houses and apartment buildings, where the civilians who are unable or unwilling to flee are trying to survive. How Moscow hopes to transform these people into loyal citizens by shelling them is a mystery, as is the question of how a bankrupt Russian nation can possibly pay for the damage that its army is now inflicting. A Russian army equipped to fight a Third World War is now trying to break Chechen resistance by sheer firepower. Their tanks are now only 200 yards from the presidential palace, but the Chechens are putting up fierce resistance. A stream of Chechen casualties is coming back from the front. Civilian volunteers, many with terrible wounds, others beyond all help. This group of Chechen fighters is about to go and reinforce their positions around the presidential palace, which is being attacked by at least 2 groups of Russian soldiers in a kind of pincer movement. The road they're going down is called Freedom Avenue, and it's under heavy fire. Tonight it seems that the Chechen defense lines have bent but not broken, and Moscow has admitted that Chechen resistance is bitter. Perhaps in frustration, the Russian Air Force has again broken Boris Yeltsin's public promise not to bomb Grozny. Chechen civilians were killed and injured when Russian planes fired rockets into a residential area. What the renewed airstrikes show is either that Boris Yeltsin is no longer concerned to make his public statements truthful, or that he is no longer in full control of his armed forces.
On a muddy hillside in western Chechnya, troops from Russia's Interior Ministry scramble at the sight of an approaching armoured personnel carrier. They don't know if it's one of theirs or one of the Chechens. As it passes, they open fire, wildly, still none the wiser who they're firing at. Minutes later, a white car is spotted on a road below them. With little thought, they again open fire. This is how we met these troops, when our car came under fire without warning. These soldiers are nervous and ill-disciplined. One officer, who told us only that his name was Yuri, said they're only responding to attacks on them, launched from local villages.
During the night, the local population comes out. They have an arms dump somewhere here. During the night, they mine the roads. And in the morning, our armor gets blown up.
The base is near the village of Zarkan-Yuat, some 20 miles west of Grozny. Their role is supposedly to disarm fighters who may have fled 2 villages outside the capital. But few of these men want to be here. They don't understand what they're supposed to be doing. All they know for sure is that the local people don't want them. The deputy commander of 2,000 Interior Ministry troops in the region is Andrei Skripnikov.
We, as the Interior Ministry troops, are conducting battles of so-called local significance here. But we are losing people for the sake of nothing.
Few of their families know they are stationed in Chechnya, nor that they are already fighting what is becoming the second, more deadly phase of the Chechen War. There's been much talk about if there will be a guerrilla war once Grozny has been taken. This provides ample evidence that such a war is already beginning. Since our car had been crippled by gunfire, we left the area courtesy of an army truck, passing columns of fresh tanks plus all manner of support vehicles. Grozny is still the target, though another war is already underway in the countryside and hills around them, fueled by what appears to be arbitrary brutality of the Russian troops. Ian Williams, News at 10, Chechnya.
Heavy fighting is now going on around the Dynamo football stadium over there, which is about half a mile away from the presidential palace. The football stadium is one of the main staging points for the Russian forces inside the city. And the fact that so much fighting is happening there indicates that in that district at least, the Chechen lines are holding. The Chechens still hold one important card, a large number of Russian prisoners. In a village south of Grozny, they paraded 39 members of the supposedly elite Russian parachute brigade. These men were sent on a reconnaissance mission, but surrendered when they were cut off. For a moment, Russian and Chechen can smile together, but in Grozny, there is only savagery, bloodshed, and tears. Julian Mannion, ITN, Grozny. Early this morning, the guns were silent, and it was possible for the defenders of the presidential palace to view the devastation that surrounds them. Much of the area is now paved with rubble and littered with smashed vehicles. It is a landscape from World War II, but here today, the wreckage is still burning. In the residential area nearby, the devastation is shocking. Great apartment buildings smashed and gutted by fire, whole trees uprooted by the shells, and incredibly, civilian survivors trying to tidy up their private corner of hell. Then, as we filmed, Russian shells began to fall again and firing broke out. Fighting has now broken out again in the central area, just over that bridge behind me over there. And the problem is that there is now so much bitterness and savagery in this conflict that it may be impossible for any ceasefire to really hold at all. At the presidential palace, Russia's truce brought more Russian gunfire. Chechens fired at Russian snipers. But the fighting was far less intense than in recent days, and in the quiet periods, the Chechens took advantage of the lull to push more troops forward and to bring out their wounded. These men, dazed by shell shock, their clothing stained with blood, still swore to fight on. For one woman, the first day of partial truce brought tears and later at least some joy. Tamsila Mukhmadiev is one of the Russian mothers trying to rescue her soldier son, who is a prisoner of the Chechens. Today in the presidential palace, the Chechens permitted her to embrace him, but said that his release, like that of the other prisoners, would depend on General Dudayev's decision. And still unscathed, a Chechen boy volunteer. Rustan Satayev is 13 years old and attached to one of the small Chechen platoons that have been battling the Russian army. He claims that he has killed Russian soldiers and says he volunteered because the Chechens' numbers are so few. But for many people remaining in Grozny, the desire is for survival, the prayer that the truce announcement is a move towards peace. For them, even the reduction in gunfire is a sign of hope. Julian Mannion, News at 10, Grozny.
Certainly it was quieter in Grozny today, but although the fighting had slackened, there were still regular bursts of sniper fire, together with some mortar and artillery rounds, especially in the area around the presidential building. Several civilians, seeing the lull in fighting as a chance to leave their homes in search of food, were reportedly killed. The International Committee of the Red Cross
saw it as an opportunity to take their first lorry load of medical and other supplies into Grozny since mid-December. But they abandoned the idea because of the continued fighting. Instead, the supplies were delivered to an outlying village. The man who thought he had organized a lasting truce returned from Grozny to Nazran in neighboring Ingushetia, angry and disappointed. Sergei Kovalyov, the Russian Human Rights Commissioner, has been a lonely figure, still trying to mediate between the Chechens and Moscow. His tireless efforts have won admiration at home and abroad, and he represents perhaps the last hope of a negotiated settlement. He told us he thought he'd done a deal with the Russian Prime Minister, Viktor Chernomyrdin, but says it was sabotaged by the Russian military.
Вдруг появляется ультимативное заявление правительства.
Suddenly there appeared an ultimatum from the Russian government, written in most insulting form. I regard it as a step to prevent the ceasefire. Those generals with big bellies don't give a damn whose children are lying dead in the streets. Their corpses being eaten by the dogs. They really don't give a damn. There is only one thing those scoundrels are thinking about in their bunker in Mozdok. How to raise their flag over the ruins of the presidential building.
Tell me about your own conversations with Viktor Chernomyrdin. What was your understanding? What was the arrangement you thought you'd come to?
When I spoke to Chernomyrdin, I set these specific goals, helping the injured and clearing the dead bodies. And we agreed upon this.
In Nazran, refugees from Grozny are reunited. They'd lost touch with each other in the scramble to leave. Refugees have flooded this city, and the central market has become a favored spot for reunions and for exchanging news from Chechnya. Today, the prospect of a ceasefire dominated conversation. Among those here, Rodima, a Grozny University professor who's working the market to help raise money for the family she's staying with. One of her friends slipped back to Grozny yesterday during the lull in fighting.
There are many houses broken near the place where we lived, and I'm very glad that my house is not broken and nobody is killed.
Sergei Kovalov is still in Nazran this evening, but is planning to return to Grozny. He's been trying once again to contact the Russian Prime Minister, Viktor Chernomyrdin. The chances of a peaceful settlement here do now look extremely slim, but the Russian Human Rights Commissioner says he has not yet given up hope. Ian Williams, Channel 4 News, Nazran.
Today, Russian state television said that Russian forces were still observing the terms of the truce, but the Chechen parliament was burning after another direct hit. Shells screamed into the city centre at a rate of up to 10 a minute. This followed a random bombardment of residential areas last night.
It is not clear what the Russians hope to gain by their relentless shelling of civilian areas, but what is certain is that it is destroying countless lives.
And in a cellar, Vladimir Leshenko, a 70-year-old paralyzed Russian war veteran. He is now trying to survive Russian shells. For these people, there is only one question. When will their nightmare end? Julian Mannion, ITN, Grozny.
Two Ingush brothers return to their village on a hilltop close to the border with Chechnya. They bring news of yet another Russian military column, which is soon moving along the valley road below. In the build-up to the latest assault on Grozny, the toing and froing of armor and supplies has been a common sight for the people of Gazayurt. Instinctively, they move out of sight. Except Medina, that is. She angrily makes her way into the garden and curses at the helicopters overhead. Last month, her son was shot dead by passing Russian soldiers who thought there were snipers in the village. Other houses have been targeted by passing Russian tanks, their gunners anxious and nervous about the village above them. Here they claim there's no reason to be targeted in such a way. The village elders have so far calmed the younger members of the community, but they say the behavior of the Russian soldiers is driving these Ingush people closer to their Chechen neighbors.
The Chechens and the Ingush are brothers. We will live and die together.
Several Ingush villages, most on Russian supply routes close to the Chechen border, have been shelled by the Russian army, even though they're some 35 miles from Grozny. As a result, the president of Ingushetia, himself an Afghan war veteran, has protested to Moscow. He says the actions of the Russian army threaten to sweep the Ingush people into the conflict.
You can't separate the Chechen problem from that of Ingushetia and the rest of the Caucasus. We're all being dragged into it. I, as a president, will hardly be able to stop people who live by the laws of the mountains, the laws of vendetta, and want to show solidarity with the Chechen people.
Nazran, the Ingush capital, is already overflowing with refugees, their numbers boosted by the intense shelling of the last 2 days. Many are staying in railway wagons at the city's station. Most are with family or friends, a remarkable display of solidarity. Arriving with the refugees today, 3 Russian members of parliament. They've been living in the south of the Chechen capital for a month and arrived in Nazran saying that only protests from the west could now stop the carnage.
The democratic West must intervene because the democratic forces in Russia are now confronting a powerful, well-established military machine which is out of control.
To see a mad wolf eating its young is a terrifying sight. But this madness is precisely what is happening to Russia.
So far, the Ingush have expressed solidarity with their Muslim neighbour, largely by humanitarian and political means. They've shown considerable restraint. Russia, though, is pushing these proud mountain people to the limit. There seems little doubt that if the conflict in Chechnya does spread, Ingushetia will be the first to ignite. With Russia pressing ahead with its assault on Grozny tonight, the atmosphere here is more tense than ever. Ian Williams, Channel 4 News, Nazran.
The Russian Air Force has used one of the most horrific weapons in its arsenal on a roundabout in the heart of Grozny. 100 yards away, a BBC television crew dived for cover as a cluster bomb went off. The explosions of the multiple bomblets, which contained ball bearings, echoed for 15 seconds. The effect on survivors was blind panic. At the roundabout, at least 3 people died in a blizzard of flying metal. In the area around the presidential palace, which is almost invisible in the smoke, a desperate battle is now taking place. The Chechens are being attacked by elite units of Russian Marines, and there is fighting from building to building, sometimes from room to room. But the Chechens are still holding out. For the casualties, it's a jolting ride down avenues full of whistling bullets, and if they're lucky, a bus ride to safety. These injured people, both soldiers and civilians, are being driven out of the city because the only hospitals still working in the area simply can't treat them properly. They're going to be driven across the Chechen border to another hospital, which, even though it's desperately short of supplies, may be able to do something about their wounds. For these people, there's hope. For many more left behind, only terror and despair.
Only from long distance or from the safety of cellars is it possible to witness the destruction of Grozny. Under this bombardment, even the Chechen fighters leave shelter only to recover their dead and wounded. In a brutal attempt to pound the Chechens into submission, the Russian army has again shelled civilian areas. For some reason, the village of Bilgatoy, 6 miles from Grozny, was their latest target. The presidential palace, symbol of rebel resistance, has lost its upper floors but remains in Chechen hands tonight, though the Russians are gaining ground and appear to be trying to encircle Grozny, cutting any line of retreat. Military commanders back in Moscow say the end is now in sight for their Chechen campaign. The fall of Grozny seems inevitable and probably imminent. But on 3 separate fronts, the formidable Russian army is still being held up and often humiliated by the Chechen fighters. Paul Davis, ITN, on the Chechen border.
The bodies are brought back secretly to Moscow, delivered in crates in the early hours, and before dawn handed unceremoniously back to their families. Russia is not proud of its Chechen war dead. Andrei Akhmadulin was 18 years old and a conscript. He'd been in the army just 6 months when his unit was ordered into Grozny on New Year's Eve. His mother knows, as every Russian knows, these teenagers should never have been sent to war.
They've sent me what was left of him. He was a young kid with no training. He hardly knew how to use a gun. Our children are being sent into a slaughterhouse.
There is intense anger here at the death of teenagers like Andrei, as there is at the reluctance of the military to tell families about the fate of their sons and brothers. However much the Russian authorities try to hide the facts, they cannot hide from scenes like this. And once again, just as during the Afghan war, it is the mothers of soldiers who are leading the opposition. Mothers who can tolerate seeing sons drafted into the army straight from school, but who can't tolerate them being sent to war. In Moscow, mothers are encouraging their sons to desert, writing letters to the authorities protesting their boys are untrained to fight. These 2 women helped their sons desert their unit last week, just as it had been ordered to Chechnya. And soon after speaking to us, they took them into hiding. Both are still teenagers. Both spoke of their total unreadiness to fight.
I'm not trained as a soldier. I've only been to the rifle range twice, and we were only given 12 rounds each. And it's the same in other units.
We spent most of our time doing chores. Of course, if Russia was attacked, we would fight. But to attack other Russians, no.
Before this war is over, these thousands of wooden boxes will have been filled. James Mates, News at 10, Moscow.
For almost an hour today, we were pinned down with a group of Chechen fighters as shells fell around the Minutska Square area of the city. Even as we waited for the bombardment to stop, the fighters dismissed suggestions of a ceasefire, saying Yeltsin was not to be trusted. In the cellars and wrecked houses, survival is the priority. After all, the same Russians promised they wouldn't bomb Grozny. In a new move, the Russian army has blown up a key bridge on the road leading south from Grozny to neighbouring Dagestan. It was the Chechens' main supply route and a road to safety should the city fall. Once again, we've seen the 2 faces of Russian policy. While their prime minister was offering a truce, the military were blowing up the Chechens' main line of retreat out of their capital.
From ITN, News at 10 with Trevor McDonald.
The symbol of Chechen resistance finally falls to Russia. Good evening. The Russians have taken the presidential palace in Grozny, the capital of Chechnya. For weeks, the Chechens had defended it with grim determination. Shelled and battered though it was, it stood for their independence. Today, they were forced to cut their losses and to withdraw. President Yeltsin said the capture of the palace meant that the military stage of his campaign against Chechen independence was effectively over. The Chechens insist it is not and say they'll fight on. ITN's Paul Davis reports from Grozny on the continuing bloodshed and shelling and his own narrow escape from it today.
In his underground bunker, the chief of Chechen military police said it was not surrender, but a strategic decision to withdraw from the palace. It's small consolation under such a bombardment, but many of the Russian weapons, like this missile, have proved defective and have failed to detonate. Small consolation indeed. All day, the Russians have been bringing up reinforcements to capitalize on their breakthrough. These are Spetsnaz, special forces trained for street fighting. This is a civilian area on the outskirts of the city. These people were civilians trying to flee the fighting. The blast from another shell blew two of us off the road. Shrapnel hit our vehicle, but we were unharmed. The Chechens said at least 7 people on the road had not been so fortunate. Paul Davis, ITN, Grozny. Even in areas supposedly captured from the Chechens several days ago, they're still meeting resistance. This Russian camp northeast of Grozny came under fire from unseen gunmen. The young conscripts appeared uncertain where the attack was coming from, returning fire in several directions. It's now 2 days since Boris Yeltsin said his Chechen campaign was virtually over, but still the fighters battle on despite the continued destruction of their capital. Paul Davis, ITN, Grozny. 3,000 feet up in the Caucasian mountains, the town of Vedeno could become a second capital if Grozny falls. There are fighters here watching for Russian helicopters and bombers, and many of the town's men have already experienced war. Like Shaman Adudayev, who's just returned from fighting the Russians in Grozny. The fight will switch to the mountains, he said. They can take our towns, but this will become a guerrilla war, a people's war, and the people will win. If the Chechens sound boastful, there is of course that other recent example of the mighty Red Army being humiliated by a fierce mountain people. It happened in Afghanistan and it can happen here, they say, predicting the fall of Boris Yeltsin before the fall of Chechnya.
It's been a difficult month at the Nazran oil depot. As the fighting has continued in neighbouring Chechnya, so supplies here have become erratic. Fuel for the region having to be brought in from central Russia. Until a few days before Russian troops entered Chechnya, this depot was still buying Chechen fuel, as were other Russian republics across the northern Caucasus. For 3 years, Moscow claimed to be operating an economic blockade against the rebel Chechen government of Zhokhar Dudayev. Yet oil kept flowing down pipelines and on trains out of Grozny. Sultan, who's worked in the industry here for 21 years, says until December he could get most oil products from Grozny at 24 hours notice.
Dudayev made no difference to us. Supplies continued as normal.
The region has also seen something of a building boom. Palatial houses are being erected outside town and along the road to the Chechen border. Outside the biggest private building company in Nazran, the Chechen, Ingush and Russian flags side by side. The director says business has never been better, catering until the war for rich Caucasian traders who thrived under Zhokhar Dudayev.
The whole economic blockade was a joke. The airport remained open and all the vital Chechen industries were working.
Grozny was the most important oil center in southern Russia. Its refining complex dominated the western approaches to the city. Pipelines carried oil from Siberia and the Caspian Sea. After Dudayev came to power, the industry did decline, but it continued to work and to export, something it could only have done with Russian approval. For 2 years, from 1991, Salman Khasiminov, 6 times world wrestling champion for the Soviet Union, headed the Chechen National Security Service, Dudayev's KGB. He says oil dominated Chechen politics. Political conflicts revolved around access to petrodollars. and the whole business was only possible because of secret and corrupt agreements with Moscow officials.
Russia could have blocked any pipeline at any time. Instead, the Russian government provided licenses for sale of the oil. And at that time, without a license from the government licensing department, it was impossible to sell a gram of oil. Although there were no formal agreements between Chechnya and Russia, the business went on as usual. The question here is how the financial accounts were settled between Russia and Dudayev's regime.
Kazimierov says the proceeds from oil sales were split 50-50 with government officials in Moscow. He can't name those officials, but says the Chechen share was paid into secret bank accounts.
Our state budget was totally closed to the people and much of the government. Dudayev himself described it as a state secret.
Right up to the eve of the war, lorries laden with Chechen goods traversed the Caucasus, unhindered by any Russian control. There can be no doubt that a lot of people here in the Caucasus and in Moscow became very rich thanks to the rebel regime of Zhokhar Dudayev. And the authorities in Moscow did very little to stop that happening, until, that is, last summer. That's when Russia adopted a new, more aggressive policy towards Chechnya. And that policy coincided with another development, a massive economic development to the south of here, based on the oil fields of the Caspian Sea. Baku, the capital of the former Soviet Republic of Azerbaijan, used to be one of the biggest oil producers in the world. Last September, the Azeri government signed a £5 billion deal with a consortium of Western companies, including BP, to develop oil fields in the Caspian Sea. It's one of the biggest projects in the former Soviet Union. But a bitter dispute erupted over how the oil will be transported once it's out of the ground. Russia wants control and lucrative transit fees and insists her pipelines be used, pipelines that pass through Grozny. Significantly, the man named by Russia to head an interim government in Grozny once the war is over is Salambek Hajiev, a Chechen who used to be Soviet oil minister. That will come as little comfort to the Russian soldiers now fighting and dying in Grozny, trying to depose a regime that was allowed to thrive thanks to corrupt officials in Moscow. Ian Williams, Channel 4 News in the northern Caucasus. Beside the frozen Volga River, the city of Samara. At this time of year, there's little to distinguish it from a string of industrial cities along the river. All have a memorial to those who died in the last war. Yet it's another conflict, the Chechen War, that has stung this city and region like nowhere else in Russia. 1 month ago today, on New Year's Eve, it was young conscripts from Samara who led the disastrous first assault on Grozny. A month on, the memory of that still haunts the young soldiers who survived, most of them 18 and 19-year-old conscripts. They're among nearly 300 being treated at Samara's military hospital. These men are from Samara's 1,000-strong 81st Motor Rifle Regiment. Though the army won't release casualty figures for the regiment, half those who led the assault are thought to have been killed, injured, or are still missing. Andrei was shot in the leg as they retreated from Grozny's railway station.
All streets were blocked, and they were shooting from every building. There were lots of grenades. They had us surrounded. There was no way out. Of course, if we'd been supported by aircraft and artillery, our losses would have been far less. Far less.
Since that terrifying night, the injured from the 81st have been joined in this hospital by a stream of casualties from other regiments. These soldiers are the lucky ones. Many others are still missing. Officially, the army says 100 from the region can't be accounted for. Others believe this is a wild underestimate. The hospital has been besieged by anxious parents. Many mothers turn up daily to try and find news of their sons. And the hospital's been receiving 1,000 telephone calls every day.
There are relatives who simply come here looking for their sons. They ask the wounded soldiers whether they have seen them or not. Some find their sons in this hospital, recovering from wounds. Those mothers are happy. The others, who don't find their sons here, they cry.
Svetlana's 19-year-old son Oleg is missing. He was in the 81st. Oleg was married days before being sent to Chechnya in December. The last time his mother heard from him was a letter written in the middle of that month. She's had little help from the army and was even threatened with the police when she tried directly approaching one general from her son's unit.
Unreasonable, senseless politicians. They just do everything for themselves. They do nothing for our boys. I just want my son back. That's the only one thing I want. I pray to God for him to return. I want my son back. I want my son back.
In response to pressure from the local committee of soldiers' mothers, the army has opened an information office in Samara. There's already been thousands of inquiries from relatives and friends of those serving in Chechnya. So far, 50 families have been notified of their son's death. Privately, many officers and doctors say the flow of information is chaotic. Many soldiers listed as alive and well may be dead or missing, and the information isn't trusted by parents. The overwhelming mood here in Samara is one of anger. Anger at the politicians and generals who they believe used young conscripts as cannon fodder in their ill-planned assault on Grozny. From here, too, statements in Moscow about the war are seen as absurd, perverse even. And in a display bordering on the surreal, the Defense Ministry paraded several soldiers in front of the press in Moscow to show how well equipped and well provided for is the army in Chechnya. One man who knows the reality, though, is Colonel General Edward Vorobyov. He resigned in December, refusing to take charge of the Chechen operation, having seen how ill-prepared were regiments like the 81st in Samara.
It was not cowardice. I was responsible for badly prepared soldiers and civilians who would have died on my orders.
The longer-term implications of the Chechen War are already being considered by General Alexander Lebed, the commander of Russia's 14th Army, Pavel Grachov's strongest critic, and the most popular general among officers in the armed forces.
Someone will have to be held responsible for thousands of corpses. Pavel Grachov has every chance of being in that highly unenviable position.
He says the only positive thing to come out of the war will be to speed up reform in the army.
There hasn't been a war for a long time, and today's politicians haven't the remotest understanding of war. That's why so many bad decisions were taken with such ease.
That will come as little comfort to the anxious parents of Samara. Even for the lucky ones who've been reunited with their sons, the Chechen War has dealt a severe blow to their confidence in the army and in the government of Boris Yeltsin. Ian Williams, Channel 4 News, Samara.
The Russian army says the operation to clear all illegal armed formations from the streets of the Chechen capital is now over. Today, for the first time, we witnessed the full extent of the devastation that was part of that operation. Weeks of continued bombing and shelling by the Russians have reduced much of this city to rubble. This is a lesson the Chechens won't easily forget. A few weeks ago, Grozny was home to 400,000 people, Russians and Chechens alike. Now it's a city of scavengers, a tiny population scratching a living out of the ruins, each with their own story to tell. The soldiers came and machine-gunned their way through our front door, says this woman. They shot our furniture to pieces, took anything they wanted and left. If they wanted to rob you, says another, they ordered you onto your knees in the street, stripped you to the waist and left you there for hours. A few refugees are returning, trying to patch together what little remains after the Russian invasion. This family were amazed to find their house still standing. They count themselves lucky. In the northern suburbs, locals are still burying the dead. This service was for a Russian soldier killed just a few yards from here in the last days of fighting for the city. Ironically, he's buried alongside Orthodox Russians he attacked. There are few Chechens in this part of Grozny. Spring has come early to the Caucasus, and the warmer weather brings the added danger of disease. Rotting corpses still litter the streets. Aid agencies are already warning of a possible epidemic. Russian soldiers now control all the streets in Grozny. They're happy to cruise around the city now they've crushed the last pockets of resistance. When the army's ready, it'll allow a new government in waiting into the capital. The opposition council was due to arrive in Grozny today. It's been waiting for the Russian army to escort its leaders into the city and allow them to set up a new administration. But there's little left here to administer, and few Chechens are likely to support a government held up by an army that's razed much of this city to the ground. At the headquarters of the Provisional Council in Znamenskoye, an hour's drive to the north of Grozny, Moscow's chosen successor for the Chechen leadership already regards himself as the legitimate successor to the ousted President Jokhar Dudayev.
The Provisional Council was the opposition. Now it's the legitimate power in Chechnya. Jokhar Dudayev is in the opposition. And anyone who says we've seized power, I can tell them that we will hold free and fair elections when we are ready.
This evening, there is an uneasy calm over the Chechen capital. There is talk of a ceasefire brokered to the southwest of the city between the Russian army and Chechen fighters. But this afternoon, there was still sporadic gunfire around Grozny, and Russian troops say they'll shoot at anything that moves after nightfall. Lawrence MacDonald, Channel 4 News, Grozny. In the village of Samashki, some 30 miles west of Grozny, a family prepares to bury the latest victim of the ceasefire in Chechnya. A father of 4, this man was working overnight at the mill when he was hit by a piece of shrapnel. Just hours before, the Russians had agreed not to use heavy weapons. This is the new front line in the Chechen War. Now the Russian army has taken Grozny, the fighting has again moved to the countryside. But at negotiations in the neighbouring village of Slipsovsk, the Chechen fighters are in no mood to compromise. They'll use the ceasefire to collect their dead, but say they're ready to fight on. The rebel president Jokhar Dudayev has gone into hiding, but outside the village we met a Russian member of parliament who'd just come back from secret talks with the Chechen leader. He told us General Dudayev is still confident of beating the Russians.
He thinks that they will be able to take Grozny back and to make the Russian troops withdraw. And the instructions he gave to his commander-in-chief for the negotiations with the Russian army are the conditions for the withdrawal of Russian troops from Grozny.
The Chechen War is by no means going all the Russian army's way. 20-year-old Vladik Gusakov is a fairly typical Russian prisoner of war. He gave himself up to the Chechens 10 days ago and doesn't want to be handed back. His captors stage-managed an interrogation for our cameras. He told us many of his officers were more interested in looting than beating the Chechen fighters into submission.
периодически вот солдатами ходили по домам, собирали видеоаппаратуру, оргтехнику, бытовую аппаратуру. Командир батальона тоже там занимался, его ингуши уже предупреждали, если ты еще раз будешь заниматься мародерством, то мы тебя никак не будем. Он продолжал, нашли трофейный Урал, и вот на трофейном Урале это все доставлялось в Владикавказ.
Another sign of the breakdown in Russian discipline is the increasing number of reports of indiscriminate acts of aggression against ordinary Chechens. This man says Russian soldiers waved him through a checkpoint. As he walked on, they shot him from behind.
Так разбитый. И я ползти начал. Где-то 20 трупов, да не видят, что я живой ползу. Минами начали забрасывать. 6 мин разорвалось. Где-то буквально от меня.
Dzhokhar Dudayev always said he'd carry on the war from the south of Grozny. But not all Chechen fighters here are pro-Dudayev. These men support the Chechen opposition. Dudayev has reduced this country to rubble and turned the people into cattle, says this man. In an election, this man says he'd vote for the Party of Peace, the party led by another famous Chechen rebel, Ruslan Khasbulatov. In his apartment in Moscow, the former speaker of the Russian parliament showed me how many Chechens turned out to support him at a rally outside Grozny just before the war. He warns the fighting could spread.
Надо прекратить военную деятельность. На мой взгляд, нельзя переносить эти военные действия на другие тровы, на другие города. Грозный уже разрушен, разгромлен. Иначе станут действительно все героическими действия. Весь Кавказ может. Когда Великая Кавказская война может.
In his address today to the Russian parliament, President Yeltsin admitted for the first time that the Russian army had badly mishandled the Chechen invasion. He'd like to say the military operation is now over, but the present ceasefire could at best be described as fragile, and the longer the fighting drags on, the weaker his position. Lawrence MacDonald, Channel 4 News, Chechnya.
The events and the tragedy in Chechnya takes its root in its origin in Abkhazia. But I'm certain that in the nearest future even this conflict will come to an end. And in that territory the jurisdiction of Russia shall be re-established. There cannot be any different solution.
But the Chechnyan crisis was allowed to continue for a long time before Mr. Yeltsin moved. Do you think he let it? Do you think he let it stand for too long?
I've just met President Yeltsin a few days ago in Almaty. He did mention to me that this was a grave mistake on the part of the leadership of Russia, that in its own time no action has been taken in order not to allow the creation of such an enormous army, which is perfectly well armed, in one of the regions of Russia. It is true that was an error, a mistake. It had to be rectified sooner or later. Obviously, it is fearsome that there have been so many victims and frightful, but all that could be done before and differently. But for the time being, the Russian leadership, now it simply had no other way out, no other solution.
Could anybody outside Russia have done anything to help? I mean, should we have, or the Americans or NATO have been prepared to do anything?
I think that Russia will be able to sort it out by itself. Well, it's something else, observers or people who would be interested in all those events. But the principal solutions must be taken by the leadership, leaders of Russia, and by those leaders of Chechnya.
Let me ask you a last question, and it's a simple one. Which is harder, to have served under Gorbachev as his foreign minister amid the disintegration of the Soviet Union, or to have been president of one of the states that emerged from that union and then became racked by civil war?
It is more difficult to be at the head of a small state. Simply because there are more problems than the large Soviet Union had at the time. And the fewer reserves and resources. But now it is easier. It's become easier. The situation is getting stabilized.
For the thousands of communists marching through the centre of Moscow this afternoon, the most welcome reform would be Mr. Yeltsin's resignation. They accuse the Russian leader of bringing this country to its knees, of sapping the lifeblood of its army. At the Red Army Theatre in Moscow, new conscripts are enjoying a day out. They're growing up in a very different world to their heroic predecessors. Today's play reflects everyday themes: drunkenness, official corruption, criticisms that go to the very top of Russian society. Hardly surprising then that these young soldiers should blame the government and not their commanders for the war in Chechnya. The decision to go in was wrong from the start. We needed a political way out, says this recruit. For many Russians, today is a time to remember this country's glorious past. A past when every citizen could take pride in the Soviet Union's superpower status. Those days are long gone. Army Day just isn't the same anymore. It marks the founding of the Red Army, an army that, under Stalin, once deported the whole of the Chechen nation in a matter of hours. Today's Russian army, after more than 2 months of fighting, still hasn't managed to crush Chechnya's bid for independence. It's hardly the time to celebrate this country's military prowess. In the past, the armed forces enjoyed pride of place in Soviet society. The Kremlin was always keen to show off its weaponry. Even if the technology wasn't state-of-the-art, it was the sheer size of the Soviet arsenal that made this country a superpower. More than 40% of the national budget was spent on the armed forces. Under communist rule, the Politburo was always prepared to finance the military. It didn't need to be asked. Nowadays, the army has to argue its case, and it just doesn't know how.
I do not believe that the military have learned the new way of doing business with Parliament or with the executive. And this is part of the problem, because the military feel frustrated that their voice is not heard. And when it is heard, it is not heeded. And that brings the army to the state of desperation.
The Chechen War has been the Russian Federation Army's first real test on the battlefield since the breakup of the Soviet Union. It failed badly. In the main push on the Chechen capital on New Year's Eve, dozens of tanks and armoured personnel carriers were crippled and then destroyed. Hundreds of young Russian soldiers were burnt alive. But the army's problem isn't just one of poor technology and underfunding. It's suffering a crisis of manpower. These conscripts were the ones who didn't get away. In the last year alone, tens of thousands of young men have dodged the draft for one reason or another. At the main recruiting station in St. Petersburg, the commander in charge of the call-up says the situation is critical.
More than 50% of new conscripts are evading the call-up. 40% have to be tracked down. Only relatively few are taken to court. In this region alone, we're looking for 700 men. And after the fighting in Chechnya, there has been a strong campaign against the war.
Today, many new recruits are taken on contract, part of Russia's new professional army. But the army can only afford minimum wages, and those who do join up are by no means those best suited to the job.
Very often the soldiers who come under the contract system to the armed forces are not willing to fight. They're not willing to be deployed to the outlying posts, and that clearly does not help the morale of the armed forces. Very often this corrupts the morale of the armed forces.
Tonight, Moscow is celebrating National Army Day as it always has. Boris Yeltsin has promised the Russian armed forces a glorious future as well as a glorious past. But the army feels badly let down by its political leaders, and unless they act soon, it might well decide to take matters into its own hands. Lawrence MacDonald, Channel 4 News, Moscow.
Today, as the tugboats of Genoa celebrated his presence here for this Perestroika conference, I spoke with Gorbachev in upbeat form. We started with history. When he came in 10 years ago tonight, had he expected to last 10, 20 years?
No, but it never really entered my mind at all. But if you want to know, really all I was thinking was if I was going to preserve power, if my thoughts really had turned on that subject, then most likely I would have had to confine myself not to real reforms at all, but to mere cosmetic adjustments and touch-ups. And for me, that would have been completely unacceptable. And I never thought about that at all. All I thought about was how to carry out my plans.
But you knew even then that if there was not change, then the Soviet Union would get into terrible trouble.
The lid on the cauldron of the Soviet Union was simply hardly holding any longer. Steam was starting to escape and the whole thing was about to blow. So it's not just that the reforms were due, they were overdue. And suggestions that somebody gave instructions for the reforms to be initiated, that's simply not serious. Attempts to reform the country were already overdue back in the time of Stalin.
But once you started on Perestroika, there was a time when you were very popular. Do you regret now that you didn't risk going for a democratic mandate?
But you know, that really wasn't the problem. I felt that my position was solid. My support was colossal. And I didn't need any additional legal actions of some sort to buttress my situation.
You were introducing democracy to a people who had never known it. You felt you were still very strong because of the power, the undemocratic power that you had. Didn't you feel you should have gone for election yourself?
Well, there's no doubt that back in 1990, towards the end of the year, public opinion polls, nationwide surveys, showed that there really wasn't any rival to Gorbachev. Gorbachev's rating was the very highest. And in second place behind him was Yeltsin, who in 1990 was running at 6 or 7%, whereas Gorbachev was scoring 70, 80%. So perhaps I was very self-confident. Perhaps I was, but it's all perhaps.
Let's look at the present day. Are you very frightened for Russia?
Well, to say that I'm frightened would be difficult after everything I've been through. I don't know what could frighten Gorbachev any longer, but I do feel alarm about the future of Russia.
Mr. Yavlinsky, for example, has said it's time Mr. Yeltsin went, that he is not fit any longer to be the president of Russia. What's your feeling? Is Mr. Yeltsin still fit to govern Russia?
Yeltsin's finished. Yeltsin is finished. It's true, I don't really know, but looking back from today, I'm not sure what Yeltsin was, whether he was more destructive than creative. It obviously didn't work out, and I noticed that long ago, back in Moscow.
Now, we have two sets of elections. There are the parliamentary elections in December, and then next year there are the presidential elections. Will you be a candidate?
I haven't yet taken a decision. I don't rule out the possibility that it may be a positive decision. But I'm still weighing up the situation. You see before you a man who, after all, knows a fair bit about politics. And I'm not interested in engaging in adventures. If I do feel that my fellow countrymen need me, and if I feel inclined, I'll go for it.
That sounds more yes than no, more da than niet.
Let's wait and see when they set the date for the elections. I'll give you an exclusive interview. And then you'll know what my decision was.
Fine, we'll certainly take you up on that, Mikhail Sergeyevich. But more seriously, which is the greater threat to Russia today, the mafia or the extreme nationalists?
It's both. I mean the adventure in Chechnya and the rise of mafia-like structures, which are the outcome of the present regime. That has to be changed.
The Yeltsin regime?
Yes, of course. Of course. Crime, we had crime before, we had the shadow economy before, but not on this scale, not on this dangerous scale. All of that's the outcome of the last few years.
There are many who say, look, the choice isn't any longer about Mikhail Gorbachev. The choice, in a way, is either to go for kind of Brezhnev or Stalin, the old order, or something completely new. Can you really offer something that is still relevant?
I don't think you have any reason to suppose, because you and we and Russia, we all know who Gorbachev is. We know his nature, we know his views, and at my age you don't change your views. I'm a convinced partisan of democracy. I want to see Russia reborn in the framework of democratic transformations. I want to see my country stable and democratic, self-confident, and peace-loving. That's my credo, and all the rest of his details of politics.
The problem is Gorbimania is in the West still. You're still very admired in the West for what you did. But the same feeling is still not really there in Russia.
I feel fine when I'm in Russia. I travel around, I make contact with people. People want to get to know me and hear my views. And it's not only my supporters who come along. There are people who don't accept my views, but nevertheless, they ask their questions, they want to know my arguments. But that's perfectly normal. That is the democratic process. And I think you could say that there's a great deal of change going on in Russia now, including attitudes to Gorbachev.
Mikhail Sergeyevich, thank you very much indeed, and I'm going to keep you to the exclusive interview you've promised me when you announce the presidency.
Yes, fine.
Thank you very much.
Fine.
Thank you.
Mikhail Gorbachev talking to me earlier here in Genoa, and it would certainly be surprising if he were to make such a comeback. Yet 10 years on from that fateful night that projected him into the leadership of the Soviet Union, only to preside over its death, that is exactly what he's aiming for.
A Russian army which hails the destruction of Grozny as victory. The ruins of General Dadaev's presidential palace standing as a grotesque monument of conquest. And the lost soul of a population left with nothing. Into all of this helplessness, a small medical team from the British Merlin organisation have joined a desperately ill-resourced aid effort.
The first time you come into Grozny, it's bad and it's really quite unbelievable what you see. But it's only when you've been in several days and you realise that this nightmare is a continuous nightmare for the people that live here, that they're not going to wake up from this.
Dr. Rob Bennett is one of the few trying to assess the health needs of Grozny's survivors in their shattered homes. With malnourishment, a lack of drugs for chronic illness, and the risk of disease, the task is colossal. And every day brings new despair for his team. This used to be the garden of an old people's home. It's now a cemetery. Since the war came to Grozny, Malika Teshinskaya has buried more than 30 of the old folk in shallow graves. She tells the team's medical coordinator, Dr. Michael Schubert, how all the staff left and she's the only one caring for 32 old folk. Only a few are able to leave their beds. They live in appalling conditions. There's no sanitation, no medical care, and the only food is flour and water noodles. She says the people are simply waiting to die.
The situation is very serious, and I'm very shocked from what I saw here. I've been for more than 4 weeks here in Grozny now in order to do a medical assessment for our organization. And I've never seen that before, and we certainly have to do something immediately.
The Merlin Group have managed to set up a clinic to assist the few remaining doctors in Grozny. They estimate that 15,000 of the city's estimated 100,000 remaining population need medical attention. 10 out of Grozny's 14 hospitals were destroyed. There simply is no health system here, and with the onset of summer, thousands of bodies lying in shallow graves, and an unknown number buried in the rubble, the risk of disease is high. Food is scarce, there is free distribution, but demand outstrips supplies.
It's all down to each individual's strength as to whether or not they get a loaf of bread. Every facet of ordinary life in Grozny has been destroyed. All that remains is a human will to survive.
And with no running water, the people often have to walk miles to aid points for their supplies. The destitution of the people is being catalogued by the Merlin Group. Here, one of their nurses meets a woman who's just returned to what remains of her home.
It was a beautiful city, and now it's terrible. It seems unreal.
The depression hanging over the people of Grozny will not go away. They see no future, and they're given no assurances as Russia's war machine rolls on to other parts of Chechnya. Andrew Simmons, News at 10 in Grozny.
Near the hospital in Budyonovsk, Russian soldiers run across the road to avoid Chechen sniper fire. The Russians have the hospital surrounded, but they're still jumpy. Troops went to action stations against a possible attack when they heard a vehicle was coming out. But in fact, a van that came out later contained the first small sign of hope in this desperate hostage crisis. A 3-year-old boy released by the Chechens because he is gravely ill with double pneumonia. But for about 1,000 other hostages, there is no such sign of mercy. In the long silences between the bursts of sniper fire, the Chechens are sitting tight with their hostages, just about 200 yards behind me over there. The Russian government has offered them an aircraft to take them to any country in the world that is willing to accept them. But so far there is no sign whatsoever that the Chechens will agree. The Chechens have allowed journalists to see some of their captives as part of a chaotic press visit to the hospital, which was punctuated by gunfire around the building. Journalists saw hostages under guard in a corridor, some of them openly appealing for help. The Chechen fighters, who include women, are still threatening to kill the hostages if the Russian government does not halt its campaign in Chechnya. Their commander is the fanatical and much feared guerrilla fighter Shamil Basayev. There has already been more than enough death and grief. At a mass burial of dozens of people who died in the first stage of the attack, helicopter gunships protected the mourners. For these Russians, the terrible war in Chechnya has come home in the most tragic way, and the worst is perhaps still to come. Julian Mannion, News at 10, Budyonovsk. At 5 o'clock this morning, Moscow time, Russian troops began what was supposed to be an operation to free more than 1,000 hostages in the Budyonovsk hospital. Some government ministers had spoken of restraint, concern for the hostages' lives. But today, the troops advanced in a blaze of firepower. The battle has been going on for 2 hours now. It's still taking place at a terrifying pace. The Russians are right in the heart of the hospital complex. They're using heavy machine guns mounted on armored vehicles, and we really don't know what the fate of the hundreds, perhaps even thousands of hostages now is. From a building opposite the hospital, we witnessed the heart-rending spectacle of the hostages waving white flags from the windows and screaming to the soldiers to stop firing. But the shooting went on. More troops were brought up, members of the elite Alpha Group Commando Force. But the operation quickly showed signs of confusion, with the Russian troops suffering losses and the hospital starting to burn. In a lull, the Chechens released about 100 of the hostages, including terrified mothers carrying their babies from the maternity unit where they had been held. Tonight, the Chechens released more hostages, saying they would free the rest if the Russian army halted its attacks in Chechnya. But there is very little hope of any kind of deal. And an operation that was supposed to save lives now seems destined to end in tragic bloodshed. Julian Mannion, ITN, Budyonovsk. The day began with gunfire. Russian bullets slammed into the battered walls of the hospital, but this time there was no full-scale attack. Instead, a little later, a team of Russian negotiators walked out into no man's land and entered the burnt-out hospital for talks with the Chechens. There is now a small glimmer of hope for the surviving hostages, but it remains very difficult to see how there can be a peaceful solution with the hatred that exists between Russians and Chechens and the blood that was spilt yesterday. Then the first stage of the deal was carried out, the release of a large number of women and children as a sign of good faith by the Chechens. For some, there was overwhelming joy. A mother burst into tears on getting back her son. The Russians have apparently agreed to let the Chechen fighters leave with some of the hostages to guarantee their safety. But the question is whether their departure will turn into a bloodbath. Julian Mannion, ITN, Budyonovsk. It was lunchtime when hooded Chechen fighters, some of them wounded, began to board the first of 6 buses at the door of the battered hospital. They took with them about 60 of the hostages who had volunteered to go with the gunmen in order to win freedom for the rest. There were also 5 Russian MPs and about a dozen Russian journalists who had decided that they would bear witness to this final stage of the hostage drama at the risk of their own lives. Inside each of the buses, about 20 Chechen gunmen and the small number of hostages on whom their lives now depend. This is how Shamil Basayev and his men hope to live to fight again another day after committing this terrorist act in a small town in Russia. As the buses passed, a glimpse of the hostages still in Chechen hands set off an explosion of grief and rage among people still waiting for news of their relatives inside the hospital. Even the moment when the bulk of the hostages were freed produced very mixed emotions. Inside the hospital, medical staff spoke of their horror at being fired on by Russian troops during Saturday's abortive attempt to storm the hospital. A doctor described how they screamed, "Don't shoot, don't shoot," but the soldiers didn't seem to hear. On one of the first buses to take hostages back to their homes, women wept at the memory of what they had just lived through. But again, the Russian government's conduct came under fierce attack. One woman called on Boris Yeltsin to withdraw Russian troops from Chechnya. Now, she said, she knows what that war is like. At an army cordon, embarrassed soldiers were confronted by this anger. "How could you possibly fire on your own people?" one man shouted. About 100 hostages are now known to have died as a result of Russian army fire. There has been relief and joy for scores of families reunited, but for the people of this town in southern Russia, these have been bitter days that will scar them forever. Julian Mannion, News at 10, Budyonovsk. Russia's worst ever hostage crisis is not yet over. The buses carrying 60 hostages and their Chechen captors traveled all night. The Chechen commander Shamil Basayev rejected a route proposed by the Russians and took the convoy round Chechnya through neighboring Dagestan. As Russian army flares lit the landscape, the Russian government's guarantee of safe passage became less and less dependable. It now seems to mean safe passage through Russia, but not inside Chechnya itself. Russian MPs who volunteered to travel with the convoy used a satellite telephone to speak to their Prime Minister Viktor Chernomyrdin, but got no clear answers. Today, the convoy halted in the Dagestani town of Kasavyurt, which has a large Chechen population. Thousands of them turned out to see Shamil Basayev, who in their eyes is a hero. Here, Basayev demanded a written Russian guarantee that his men would not be attacked when they crossed the Chechen border. He didn't get it, and after an 8-hour wait, the convoy moved on towards Chechnya. Tonight, the question all Russia is asking is, will the army catch Shamil Basayev? If they fail, it will be a serious defeat. For Basayev has proved that in spite of Russia's overwhelming military superiority, the Chechen rebels can strike at a Russian town and destroy its heart. Julian Mannion, News at 10, Budyonovsk. The return of the last hostages to Budyonovsk brought some solace to the battered town, but it did not dull the anger that many people feel about the behavior of Russia's army and government during the hostage crisis. A doctor released by the Chechens last night expressed his bitterness at the army's attack on the hospital last Saturday.
That day, 3 of our patients went mad as a result of the fighting. I saw it myself.
The government is clearly in disarray over the disaster at Budyonovsk, which has given the political opposition the opening it has long been seeking. The consequences of Basayev's raid may go far beyond the physical damage and the lost lives.
The car that exploded was parked in the very center of Grozny, alongside the headquarters of the Russian-backed administration. It exploded at lunchtime, without warning, with devastating effect. A terrorist attack on their own capital. Chechen rebels have promised to carry on their fight for independence from the Russian Federation. Their military commanders warned they'll take action to block elections due here later this month.
While the Russian government insists these elections will go ahead, Chechen separatists are determined to disrupt them. This attack on the administration building in the centre of Grozny shows how far they're prepared to go.
Russian troops are deployed across the Chechen Republic. Attacks on their positions have increased as the elections draw closer. But officials at the Central Electoral Commission told us voting will go ahead. They even predicted a high turnout. Chechnya needs elections now, they said. But in the towns and villages outside Grozny, there is still strong support for the separatists. People here say they'll boycott the elections. They regard the Russians as an army of occupation. If the Russians stay, they can expect further attacks, said one regional commander. Almost a year after Russia invaded Chechnya, any lasting ceasefire appears further away than ever. Lawrence McDonnell, Channel 4 News, Grozny.
From ITN, News at 10 with Trevor McDonald.
Held at gunpoint, the hostages awaiting their fate. Good evening. 2,000 hostages, many of them women and children, are still being held at gunpoint tonight in a hospital in southern Russia. Their captors are Chechen guerrillas, demanding Russia's withdrawal from their country and apparently prepared to kill and be killed. A similar hostage-taking last June ended in more than 100 civilian deaths and the Russian climb down. Today, a furious President Yeltsin rounded on his generals for letting it happen again and demanded immediate and resolute action. Our Moscow correspondent Julian Mannion got to Kislyar a short time ago and near to the besieged hospital. He told me what's happening there tonight.
We're on the outskirts of Kislyar. The authorities are keeping journalists out of the town tonight. They say they're going to admit us tomorrow morning. But from where we are, a couple of miles away from the hospital, we've seen flares hanging over that building, and we've heard the sound of sporadic gunfire, quite heavy gunfire about an hour ago, though that's died away now. On our way here, and that's only a couple of hours ago, we passed an enormous column of Russian armour moving towards the town. It appeared to be a full motorised division on the move.
From what you've seen, do you get the impression that the Russians are preparing to end this siege?
The Russians certainly have the ability to end this by force, but it could cost enormous bloodshed. And right now, tonight, they must be really wondering what their next move will be.
Julian Mannion, thank you. The latest Russian hostage crisis is still unresolved tonight, with Chechen hostage takers nearly home but surrounded by Russian troops. The number of hostages is now down to about 160. The Chechens are demanding safe passage and are again threatening to kill if they don't get it. Their convoy left the southern Russian town of Kislyar heading for Chechnya, but was stopped at Pavomskaya, a small village on the border. ITN's Julian Mannion watched events unfold there today.
Boris Yeltsin had promised a resolute response to this latest act of Chechen terrorism. But early this morning, a convoy of buses, including both the terrorists and about 150 of their hostages, was allowed to leave for Chechnya. As they moved towards the border, the gunmen seemed jubilant, their hostages relatively calm. A woman hostage even held a rifle that a Chechen had lent her. All of them appeared to believe that a deal had been done and that the Russian government would stick to it, in spite of the helicopter gunships roaring above them. The convoy has now come to a virtual halt on a broken piece of road over which the vehicles can only crawl. Russian helicopters are circling overhead, occasionally swooping low to buzz the terrorists. But so far, there's no sign of an all-out Russian attack. But at a village on the Chechen border, the tension suddenly grew. When one bus got stuck, Chechens and Russians confronted each other only yards apart. And when the buses tried to move forward again, the Russians halted them in an open field. The Chechens overheard radio messages from Russian commanders ordering their troops to surround the convoy. Helicopter gunships fired bursts of warning shots to prevent the buses from moving. and for a time it seemed that an assault was imminent. On the buses, the hostages began to wave white flags to try and persuade their army not to fire on them. After several hours of standoff, heavily armed Chechens advanced on the nearby Russian border post. Inside, Russian Special Forces troops appeared in no mood to resist, and they rapidly surrendered, stacking their weapons neatly against a wall. The Chechens took over the whole village, and tonight they remain there with their hostages. The Russian Prime Minister Viktor Chernomyrdin has promised that violence will not be used against the convoy, and that must represent some hope that further bloodshed can be avoided. Julian Mannion, News at 10 on the Chechen-Dagestan border. Russian Special Forces troops are getting ready for action as their army throws a ring of steel around the village where the Chechen rebels are still holding more than 100 hostages. At the scene, a Russian general has said that the gunmen must be eliminated. Every type of heavy equipment is now being moved towards the village of Pervomaisk. Negotiations are still taking place, but it all looks ominously like the preparations for an assault. ITN was the only television company to slip through the Russian army cordon. In the village, our cameraman found Chechen rebels digging trenches as they prepare to fight to the death. The Chechens have placed small groups of fighters in different parts of the village, each group holding some of the hostages. Many of the hostages are women and children, now clearly in some distress, cooped up in houses abandoned by local residents.
We are not afraid. We will defend ourselves, and the Russians can destroy this place if they want to.
The Chechens have told the Russians that they will release many of the women and children in exchange for a written guarantee of safe conduct. But the Russians say that all the hostages must be released now. As the deadlock continues, the rebels are putting on a show of defiant bravado before what could be their final battle. Julian Mannion, News at 10 on the Chechen-Dagestan border.
Chechen rebels holding dozens of hostages now have until tomorrow to release them. Russia said it was giving the rebels another night to think things over. Julian Mannion reports from the border of Chechnya and Dagestan.
At dawn, busloads of Special Forces troops moved forward, and at 10 a.m. local time, the hour of the deadline, they took up positions close to the village. Armoured vehicles started their engines, and in the distance we could hear soldiers using loud hailers to call on the Chechens to give up the hostages and promising that their lives would be spared. But the Chechens did not respond, and the expected attack never took place. According to the Russian news agency TASS, the deadline has been extended, though it's not clear till when. A Russian military spokesman has now said that the deadline was postponed in order to save innocent lives. But tonight, the buses containing the Special Forces troops are returning to positions close to the village, and it seems that the Russians are still considering the military option. Julian Mannion, ITN, at the Chechen-Dagestan border.
Good evening. President Yeltsin ordered his troops into action today in the Russian hostage crisis down on the Chechen border. They went in, guns blazing, 16 hours ago, but again and again they've been fought off by the Chechens. There have undoubtedly been casualties on all sides, though it's impossible to establish any details. The Chechens say 9 hostages died in the Russian attacks. The Russians claim to have got 9 out safely. ITN's Julian Mannion was there throughout the battle today.
The attack began at around 9 a.m. local time. Russian helicopter gunships blasted the outskirts of the village. Explosions could be seen among the houses, and smoke started rising from buildings set on fire. The helicopters dropped flares to deflect anti-aircraft missiles, and Russian combat troops ran forward to take up their assault positions. When we got close to the village on foot, the troops tried to keep us away from the scene. Russian soldiers are still fighting for the edge of the village of Pervomaiskaya, well over an hour after the attack began. And the soldiers on the other side of this ditch here are becoming extremely angry at our presence. They've fired warning shots to make us go away, and they're now calling to the authorities further back to take us out. But we stayed and saw the Russian troops using machine guns and mortars to try and dislodge Chechen rebels from houses on the fringe of the village. Somewhere inside those houses were pockets of rebels holding small groups of hostages. But the Russians were unable to cross the open ground between because of the Chechen fire that continued in spite of the bombardment. The helicopters fired again. Russia's Interior Ministry has claimed that no houses containing hostages have been set ablaze in the attack. But on the southern side of the village where we were, the damage seemed widespread and often indiscriminate. A spokesman for the Russian President Boris Yeltsin says that he authorized the assault because he believed that any further delay would threaten the lives of the hostages. But it is difficult to see how this operation can ensure their safety. The Russian government says that the final order for the attack was given after the Chechens fired on Russian negotiators and began shooting the hostages. The Chechen rebel leader General Dudayev has dismissed this statement as a crude lie. Relatives of the civilian hostages gathered near the scene, many in obvious distress. A statement this evening by the Russian government said that their troops have so far managed to free 9 of the hostages. Fighting is still going on, with journalists kept well back. The Russians say they are inside the village, but the Chechens are still putting up fierce resistance. And shells apparently fired by the Chechens have now landed in the village where we are based, just down the road from Pervomaiskoye. Residents are now fleeing this area in panic. Julian Mannion, News at 10 on the Chechen-Dagestan border. The Russian hostage rescue operation has turned into a major battle. The village of Pervomaiskoye is shrouded in smoke and fog, and journalists are being kept well back. But we know that Russian troops are now fighting house to house inside the village, and they are using overwhelming firepower in spite of the clear danger to the hostages. Russian heavy guns are firing on the village, and in between the blasts we can hear the sounds of rifle and machine gun fire drifting across the plain. It all indicates that the Chechen rebels are still putting up fierce resistance, and Russian officials are now declining to predict how long this operation will take. The Russians now say that they have freed more than 20 of the 100 hostages who were originally held. This morning, about a dozen were moved out of the battle area, with police preventing journalists from interviewing them. At least one of the women had asked the Russians to take her back to the village so she could be with her husband, who's still being held by the Chechens. But all the hostages looked relieved as the bus pulled away. One of the hostages had a bullet wound in the leg, and we were asked to take him to hospital in our bus. On the way, the man gave us one of the first eyewitness accounts of the inferno he survived.
It's like hell there. You don't dare to lift your head. Everything's just going down on top of you. It's coming from here, there, everywhere.
The man escaped by hiding in a loft, but 3 other hostages with him were killed in the shelling. In spite of the hostage casualties, the Russians have now rejected a Chechen offer of fresh talks. The fate of the Chechens now seems sealed, but no one yet knows how many of the hostages will survive. Julian Mannion, News at 10, near the village of Pervomaiskoye.
From ITN, News at 10 with Trevor McDonald.
Russia abandons hostages with a vow to crush the Chechens. Good evening. The Russians gave up trying to free the hostages in Pervomaiskoye today. Instead, they've been pouring rocket and shell fire into the village near the Chechnya border in an all-out barrage, apparently calculated to obliterate the rebels. A Russian military spokesman said his information was that most of the hostages had already been killed by their Chechen captors anyway. The Chechens denied it. Russian special ground forces had earlier been driven back with heavy casualties. ITN's Julian Mannion was again the only television journalist in the immediate battle zone today.
The Russian army is now using one of the most feared weapons in its arsenal. These are Grad missile launchers, and this morning I saw Russian soldiers firing them into the village of Pervomaiskoye, where the Chechen rebels are still holding out. Earlier, Russian helicopter gunships and artillery had conducted the most ferocious bombardment yet of the ruined village. Gunships queued in the skies to take their turn, firing rockets and machine guns. It was during this bombardment that a Russian spokesman announced that most of the hostages are now dead. He claimed that they have been executed by the Chechens on the orders of their leader, General Dudayev, and that the time has now come to bring the military operation to an end. The Russians appear to have virtually written off the hostages in their determination to crush Chechen resistance. No one knows for sure how many hostages are still alive in the destroyed village, but it seems that now they no longer form any part of Russia's military calculations. One possible explanation for the Russian army's hardening attitude is that last night they suffered a severe reverse in house-to-house fighting. Weary Special Forces troops returning from the battle told us that they had taken serious losses in firefights in the center of the village. During the fighting, the Russian Special Forces commander, Colonel Andrei Kristyaninov, was killed. It's a nightmare in there, this officer told me. We fell into a trap. There are bodies everywhere. This afternoon, the Russian authorities told journalists to leave the villages closest to the fighting. There may now be fewer pictures to embarrass the Kremlin, but the desperate battle for Pervomaiskaya goes on. Julian Mannion, ITN, near the village of Pervomaiskaya.
But just why is Moscow using such ruthless military force against a few Chechens? And why does Chechnya matter to it? The Chechens are a mainly Muslim people with a fiercely independent character who've resisted Russian domination since the early 19th century. Chechnya's independence claim 4 years ago was ignored. A rebellion in Grozny last year was crushed, leaving the capital in ruins. Chechnya is 1,000 miles from Moscow in the Caucasus Mountains, a strategic economic and military corridor between Russia and Central Asia. Neighboring Georgia and Azerbaijan are already independent. Now, Chechnya's cause has been taken up by Muslim sympathizers in Turkey, which has vied for control of the region for centuries. President Yeltsin needs to contain the crisis to restore his credibility. The larger fear is that if he doesn't, other regions might be encouraged to break away from Russia and the terrorism might spread. Good evening. The 4-day battle between Russian troops and Chechen rebels ended today in bloody surrender. President Yeltsin's troops finally took control of the border village, killing a large number of the rebels. Pictures from the battleground today showed the terrible cost in human life. Somehow, 82 of the 100 or so hostages were rescued. The Russians say the rest are missing, though they're not necessarily dead. Our correspondent Julian Mannion reports from the battle zone.
They survived 4 days of hell, but now it has ended in humiliation and defeat. There are 38 Chechen survivors, many of them wounded. Already the interrogators are at work looking for information about the rebel leader Salman Rudayev, one of the few who may possibly have got away. Most of them did not. In the early hours of this morning, in a heavy snowfall, the Chechen rebels made a desperate attempt to break out. As they tried to creep through the Russian lines, another fresh Chechen unit tried to distract the Russian troops by attacking them from behind. But it was not enough, and a stretch of open ground became a killing field. Today, Russian troops fanned out to hunt for possible survivors. If the Chechen commander does get away, it could take a little gloss from Boris Yeltsin's overwhelming victory. Part of that victory has been the release of many hostages. According to the Russians, 82 have survived, more than 20 are unaccounted for. Pervomaiskaya is now a smoking ruin, a small village on a country road that turned into a death trap. Julian Mannion, News at 10, near the village of Pervomaiskaya.
Julian Mannion was the only British television reporter to witness the fighting close up at the height of the battle for Pervomaiskaya. A few minutes ago, I spoke to him at a satellite station a short drive from the village, and I asked him whether there were any winners and losers in the bloody conflict.
Well, the Russian President Boris Yeltsin will definitely count himself among the winners. He's been under mounting political pressure as this year's presidential election approaches, and the main criticisms of his leadership are the failures in law and order in this country and the chaotic war in Chechnya. Now, on this occasion, the president deliberately set out to teach the Chechen rebels a lesson, and in purely military terms, he succeeded about as well as he could have hoped to do. What is still unclear are the long-term political consequences of this bloodshed here on the Chechen-Dagestan border.
Is this, you think, you've watched this battle from close range for some time now, is this the end of the Chechen rebellion?
No, most certainly it isn't. The Chechens are extremely determined, even fanatical. This fanaticism has been bred under Russian shell fire, and it's not going to go away. This is a real shock to them. They've suffered great losses here. They've suffered losses of some of their leading personalities. We don't yet know if Salman Rudayev, who is in fact a relative of the Chechen leader General Dudayev, if he's still alive. But what it is a shock to them. But what the real question now is whether this is going to calm their resistance, if I can put it that way, to quell it, or to inflame it still further.